Ethan watched the screen, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. The man on the phone, a trusted friend with a convincing bedside manner, had just finished informing his wife Clara of his sudden and severe cardiac event. The performance had been flawless, filled with grave tones and urgent medical jargon that Ethan himself had scripted. He wasn't in a sterile hospital bed, tangled in wires and tubes. He was in an equally sterile, soundproofed rental office across the city, watching a high-definition live feed from a microcamera concealed in the spine of a book on their living room shelf. It was a book on architectural history he'd given Clara, one she had never opened. The irony was not lost on him. He had told himself this was a test, a final, desperate, and perhaps insane measure to understand the silent, yawning chasm that had opened up in his 5-year marriage. He had needed to know, with empirical certainty, what existed in that space between them. He had expected tears. He had anticipated panic, a frantic call to his own parents, a desperate plea for more information from the doctor. He had braced himself for the sight of his wife, shattered by the news, collapsing onto the very sofa she now sat upon with such unnerving stillness. He did not expect her first call to be to Julian. The name echoed in the silent room, a ghost from her past he had been assured was long exorcised. He watched her fingers dance across the screen of her phone, her expression not one of grief, but of tense, focused calculation. There was no hesitation. The call connected, and her voice, when it came, was low and urgent, the camera's microphone picking it up with painful clarity. "It happened," she said, and the two words were a death sentence for the man Ethan used to be. The man who had believed in her. He certainly didn't expect Julian to be walking through their front door less than 20 minutes later. He used his own key. A key Ethan had never known he possessed. Julian's expression was not one of concern for a fallen rival, but of triumphant, predatory opportunity. He moved into the space, into Ethan's home, with an air of ownership that was breathtakingly arrogant. He didn't embrace Clara in a gesture of comfort. He kissed her, a long, deep, possessive kiss that spoke of familiarity and shared secrets. It was a kiss that desecrated every memory Ethan held within those walls. What they didn't know was that the walls themselves, like everything else, belonged to a man they had fatally misunderstood. Within 24 hours, their confidence would be a ruin, and their world would be dismantled, piece by meticulous piece. We've all felt underestimated at some point, haven't we? Pushed aside, dismissed, or made to feel small. If you've ever fantasized about the moment the tables turn, give this story a like and subscribe, because we're about to watch that fantasy unfold. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from as we witness the beginning of the end for Clara and Julian. The stage was set. The audience, Ethan, was watching. And the actors had no idea they were in a tragedy of their own making. The first crack in the foundation of his marriage had appeared not with a bang, but with the polite clinking of silverware against fine china. It was 6 months into their marriage, at the first formal dinner with her parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance. Their home was a monument to old money and carefully curated status, a sprawling colonial with imposing white pillars that seemed to look down on the world. The air inside was thick with the scent of lemon polish and a faint floral perfume that clung to Eleanor like a second skin. Ethan had felt like an exhibit from the moment he walked in. Richard, a man whose posture was as rigid as his opinions, had shaken his hand with a grip that was more of an assessment than a welcome. Eleanor had appraised his suit, a well-made but unassuming charcoal gray, with a flicker of a smile that didn't reach her cold, blue eyes. Clara, his wife, had shimmered at his side, beautiful and radiant, yet strangely distant, as if she were a tour guide in her own life. "So, Ethan," Richard began, after the appetizer plates were cleared. He swirled the deep red wine in his glass, the movement practiced and condescending. "Clara tells us you're a financial consultant." He said the words as if they were a quaint, slightly embarrassing hobby, like collecting stamps or building ships in bottles. That's right, Ethan replied, his voice even. He met Richard's gaze without flinching. I help companies and individuals structure their long-term financial strategies. Fascinating, Richard murmured, taking a slow sip of his wine. And is there much of a future in that? For a small, independent operator, I mean? It all seems to be consolidating into the big firms these days. The Leviathans. Hard to compete with that, I'd imagine. The insult was clear, wrapped in a thin veneer of paternal concern. Small, independent operator. He was painting Ethan as a minnow swimming in a sea of sharks. Ethan felt Clara shift beside him, a subtle tension in her body. He waited for her to speak, to defend him, to say anything at all. The silence stretched. I find my niche serves me well, Ethan said calmly. Not everyone wants to be a number at a global conglomerate. Some clients prefer a more personal, dedicated approach. Eleanor let out a small, tinkling laugh. Oh, of course. How charming. It's so important to have a passion. I knew a woman who started a little business making artisanal jams. She was quite happy with it, I believe. The comparison hung in the air, grotesque and deliberate. His career, his life's work, equated to a hobby making fruit preserves. Ethan placed his fork down, the small sound unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. He looked at Clara. Her eyes were fixed on her plate, a faint blush on her cheeks. She was embarrassed, but not for her parents. She was embarrassed for him. The realization was a small, sharp sting. And Julian, Richard continued, his tone brightening considerably, I was speaking with his father just the other day. They've made him a junior partner at the firm, 29 years old. A remarkable trajectory. He just closed on a magnificent property in the hills. The boy's a rocket. Julian, the ex-boyfriend, the ghost at the banquet. He was the yardstick against which Ethan was perpetually measured and found wanting. Clara had sworn that relationship was ancient history, a youthful mistake. Yet her parents spoke of him as if he were the heir apparent, the standard of excellence she had inexplicably abandoned. That's wonderful for him, Ethan said, the words tasting like ash. He refused to let them see the effect. He picked up his wineglass, his hand perfectly steady. Inside his jacket pocket, his fingers brushed against the smooth leather of a thin, unassuming folder he always carried. It was a habit, a grounding mechanism. It contained the architecture of his real life, the one they couldn't see. Indeed, Eleanor chirped, he has such ambition. It's so attractive in a young man. A drive to conquer, not just to consult. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in veiled condescension. They asked about his car, a reliable but modest sedan, and wondered aloud if he ever felt intimidated on the freeways next to the Porsches and Maseratis. They inquired about the neighborhood where he and Clara had bought their house, a charming, gentrifying area of the city, and referred to it as up and coming with the same tone one might use for a promising but slightly feral rescue dog. Through it all, Clara remained a silent, beautiful statue. When her parents aimed their barbs at him, she would study the intricate pattern on her plate. When they lauded Julian, she would offer a tight, non-committal smile. She was a passive observer at her own husband's vivisection. Each moment of her silence was a small betrayal, accumulating like a debt he hadn't realized he was incurring. Driving home that night, the silence in the car was heavier than the overstuffed formality of her parents' house. Your parents are something, Ethan finally said, his voice neutral. They're just from a different generation, Ethan, Clara replied, her voice defensive. They don't mean anything by it. It's just how they talk. They compared my career to making artisanal jam, Clara. Oh, you're being too sensitive. Mother says things like that to everyone. And Daddy is just protective. He sees Julian's success and he worries. Worries about what? That I can't provide for you? The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Of course not, she said too quickly. She turned to look out the window, a clear signal that the conversation was over. I'm just tired. It was a long evening. But Ethan knew it was more than that. It wasn't just her parents, it was her. Her silence had been an endorsement. In that opulent dining room, under the weight of her family's judgment, she had weighed him against Julian, against their world of aggressive ambition and ostentatious wealth, and she had let him be found wanting. He drove on, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He said nothing more, but the decision was already forming in his mind. He would not confront them. He would not argue. He would simply continue to build. He would let them live in their comfortable, arrogant blindness. For now. He was a man who understood long-term strategies, after all, and the most satisfying returns often came from the most patient, disciplined investments. The humiliation was not a singular event, it was a climate. It was the air he breathed whenever the Vances were present. The second major storm front moved in a year later, centered around the topic of a vacation. Ethan, wanting to give Clara a break from her demanding job in marketing, had planned a 2-week trip. He had been meticulous, securing a private villa on a quiet, secluded coast in Southeast Asia. It was a place of understated luxury, designed for privacy and peace, not for Instagram bragging rights. He'd presented it to her with a genuine sense of excitement, showing her pictures of the infinity pool that bled into the turquoise sea, the open-air living spaces, the promise of quiet mornings and serene sunsets. Clara had seemed pleased enough, but her enthusiasm was tempered with a question that should have been a warning. "What's the name of the resort again?" he told her. She nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "I'll just look it up," she said. The call from Eleanor came 2 days later. "Ethan, darling," her voice was syrupy sweet, a confection laced with poison. "Clara was just telling us about your little holiday plans. How rustic." Ethan gripped the phone, his gaze drifting to the architectural plans for a new commercial skyscraper spread across his home office desk. He was finalizing the financing structure for a project worth 9 figures. To the Vances, he was a man who planned rustic holidays. "It's one of the most exclusive properties in the region, Eleanor," he said, his tone mild. "It's designed for privacy." "Oh, privacy is such a lovely word for off-brand, isn't it?" she laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in an empty glass. "Richard and I were just at St. Bart's. You simply cannot move for bumping into someone fabulous. We saw the CEO of a major tech firm arguing with a senator over the last bottle of rosé at lunch. It was marvelous. That's a real vacation. You have to be seen, darling. It's part of the game." "We're not really looking to be seen, Eleanor. We're looking to get away." "Of course you are," she cooed. "And Julian, honestly, that boy, he just took his new girlfriend, a model of course, to Lake Como. Rented a Riva boat for the week. George Clooney's neighbors. Can you imagine? Clara would have adored that. She has such a flair for that kind of lifestyle." The implication was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Clara deserves more. Clara deserves Julian. You are giving her less. That evening, the topic resurfaced. Clara was scrolling through her social media feed, her face illuminated by the phone's glow. "Julian's in Como," she said, her voice wistful. "The pictures are breathtaking." "I'm sure they are," Ethan said, not looking up from his laptop. "My friends are all asking where we're going," she continued, a note of complaint in her voice. "When I tell them the name of the place, they just say, 'Oh, where's that?' It's not exactly the Four Seasons, is it?" "No," Ethan said, finally looking at her. "It's not. The Four Seasons is a hotel chain. This is a one-of-a-kind private estate. I thought you wanted something unique." "Unique is fine," she sighed, tossing her phone onto the sofa cushions. "But it's also obscure. It feels like we're hiding, like we can't afford to be anywhere that matters." The words struck him with physical force. Like we can't afford it. Her perception of him was so completely, so fundamentally wrong. He could buy the entire hotel in St. Bart's where her parents had stayed and turn it into his private summer home if he wished. He could purchase the villa in Lake Como and the Riva boat that came with it. The company her father, Richard, worked for as a senior vice president, Ethan's private equity firm had acquired a controlling interest 6 months ago. Richard's boss reported to a board that Ethan indirectly controlled. He was Richard's boss's boss's boss. All of this was a secret. His wealth, managed through a series of trusts and holding companies, was deliberately low profile. He had never been interested in the ostentatious displays the Vances worshipped. He believed true power was silent, not loud. He had wanted Clara to love him for who he was, not for what he had. But now he saw the flaw in his logic. By hiding his wealth, he had created a vacuum, and her family's toxic narrative had rushed in to fill it. Clara had not only believed it, she had embraced it. He felt a cold fury rise within him, but he mastered it instantly. It wasn't time. The data was still incomplete. A confrontation now would be emotional, messy. He preferred precision. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the worn leather folder. He didn't open it. He just rested his hand on it. Inside were the deeds, the trust documents, the share certificates. It was his silent rebuttal, his patient, waiting truth. "The tickets are booked, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We're going." The vacation was a disaster, not because of the location, which was paradise, but because of the guest he hadn't invited, the ghost of their life unlived. Clara was physically present, but her mind was elsewhere. She took endless photos, not of the stunning scenery, but of herself, carefully curated and filtered for her online audience. She complained about the lack of a bustling nightlife. She compared the exquisite local cuisine unfavorably to whatever trendy restaurant Julian had tagged himself in that week. She was performing for an audience of her friends and family, trying to polish his rustic vacation into something that looked expensive. She was treating their marriage like a brand that needed better marketing. On their last night, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the moonlit sea, she delivered the final cut. "You know," she said, staring at the horizon, "I love you, Ethan, but sometimes I wonder if you really have any ambition." Ethan looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw a stranger, a beautiful, hollow stranger who had bought into a false and ugly system of value. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt a profound and weary sadness, and beneath it the cold, hard bedrock of decision. "I think I have all the ambition I need," he said softly. The test was no longer a vague idea, it was a certainty. He needed to know the full extent of the rot. He needed to see what she would do if she thought he was not just unambitious, but gone. He needed to fake his own death, or the next best thing. The plan took 3 months to orchestrate. Ethan approached it not with the frenzied emotion of a betrayed husband, but with the dispassionate precision of a financial strategist executing a hostile takeover. His objective was clear: to create a crisis so believable, so absolute, that Clara's true nature would be revealed beyond any shadow of a doubt. This was not about revenge, he told himself. It was about diagnosis. He had to know the full extent of the disease before he could decide on the cure. His first call was to David Chen, his oldest friend and a brilliant anesthesiologist. More importantly, David was a man of unshakable integrity who owed Ethan a significant debt of gratitude. Years earlier, David's father had faced financial ruin due to a disastrous business deal, and Ethan had quietly intervened, restructuring the debt and saving the family's legacy without ever taking a dime or asking for public credit. David knew the true scale of Ethan's success and, more importantly, the quality of his character. They met in a private room at a discreet downtown club. Ethan laid out the situation, omitting the rawest emotional details, but providing enough context for David to understand the stakes. "You want me to what?" David asked, his eyes wide over the rim of his whiskey glass. "You want me to call your wife and tell her you've had a heart attack? Ethan, that's insane. It's unethical." Is it more unethical than allowing a lie to destroy a man's life? Ethan countered, his voice low and steady. I am not asking you to falsify a medical record. I am not asking you to involve the hospital. I am asking you to make a phone call, to play a part in a private domestic drama. I need to know what happens when she thinks I'm incapacitated, when she thinks the modest provider is out of the picture. What does she do? Who does she turn to? David was silent for a long time, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He looked at his friend, saw the deep pain masked by a chillingly calm demeanor. He remembered the quiet dignity with which Ethan had saved his own family, seeking no thanks, no recognition. This Julian, David said finally, is he the one you suspect? He's the symptom, Ethan replied. Her family, their values, their constant corrosive judgment. That's the disease. He's just the manifestation they prefer. I need to know if she's infected beyond recovery. And the cameras? Already in place, Ethan said. State of the art, audio and video, motion-activated recording with a live feed I can monitor from anywhere. I had a security firm do a sweep for bugs 2 months ago. They found the bugs they had planted themselves. Clara thinks our home is a fortress. It is. It's my fortress. David let out a long, slow breath. If you're wrong about this, Ethan, if she breaks down, if she's truly devastated, you could destroy her for no reason, and your marriage with her. If I'm wrong, Ethan said, a flicker of the old hope in his eyes, then I will spend the rest of my life making it up to her. I will get on my knees and beg her forgiveness. Nothing would make me happier. But I don't think I'm wrong, David, and I can't live like this anymore. I can't live with a ghost in my house and a stranger in my bed. I have to know the truth. The conviction in Ethan's voice was absolute. David nodded slowly. All right, I'll do it. Give me the script. I'll make it sound real. The second piece of the puzzle was legal. Ethan met with Evelyn Reed, the lead counsel for his primary holding company. She was a woman in her late 50s, sharp as a shard of glass and utterly loyal. Her office on the top floor of a skyscraper Ethan's company owned had a panoramic view of the city. They met after hours, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. Ethan didn't tell her about the fake heart attack. He framed it as a standard, if accelerated, asset protection strategy in the event of a contentious divorce. I want everything partitioned, he instructed, his voice echoing slightly in the vast office. All assets acquired before the marriage, all assets held in the Phoenix Trust, all controlling interests in subsidiary companies. I want them firewalled, airtight. Evelyn's pen flew across a legal pad. She was used to high-stakes, complex maneuvers. Standard procedure. What about shared assets? The house? The joint accounts? Freeze them, Ethan said, effective upon my verbal command. I want you to draw up divorce papers. Cite infidelity. I also want you to prepare a complete portfolio of my personal net worth, simplified and understandable to a layman, and a separate file detailing my firm's controlling interest in Northgate Industries. Evelyn paused, her pen hovering over the paper. Northgate? Richard Vance's company? The very same, Ethan said, his face impassive. Evelyn allowed herself a small, grim smile. She had met Richard Vance at a charity gala once. He had been pompous and dismissive. This is going to be a very interesting divorce, Ethan. Do you have definitive proof of the infidelity? I will, Ethan said. Soon. Be ready to move, Evelyn. I'll give you 24 hours notice. I'm always ready, she replied, closing the pad. The final piece was the location. He rented the small, soundproofed office under a shell corporation's name, paying in cash. He brought in a high-end monitor, a secure laptop, and a small cot. It was a Spartan command center for the final act of his marriage. On the designated day, he woke up beside Clara. He looked at her sleeping face, a perfect, placid mask. He felt a pang of sorrow for the woman he thought he had married. He kissed her on the forehead, a Judas kiss in reverse. I have an early meeting across town, he whispered, though she didn't stir. I'll see you tonight. He left the house, the sun just beginning to tint the sky gray. He didn't go to a meeting. He drove to his command center, set up the laptop, and brought the live feed online. He watched her wake up, move through their home, a place that was about to become a stage. At 9:15 a.m., he sent a text to David. Now. He settled into his chair, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He was calm. He was prepared. He was a man about to watch his own life burn down, just to see what, if anything, would rise from the ashes. The phone in his house began to ring. The test had begun. The living room on the screen was bathed in the soft morning light. Clara, dressed in expensive athleisure wear, picked up her phone. Ethan leaned closer, the volume on his speakers turned up. He could hear the faint, tinny sound of David's voice, a carefully constructed symphony of concern and gravity. He watched Clara's face. Her expression tightened. She sat down on the sofa. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. Her body went rigid, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, processing. A cardiac event? She repeated, her voice a strange, flat monotone. How severe? David's voice murmured on, explaining the fabricated details. Discovered unconscious by a colleague, rushed to the hospital, currently in critical but stable condition in the ICU. We need you to come to the hospital, Mrs. Miller, David concluded. The admitting desk at St. James downtown will have your name. Yes, Clara said, her voice still unnervingly controlled. Yes, of course. I'll be there as soon as I can. She ended the call. For a full minute, she did not move. Ethan held his breath, a sliver of hope warring with a mountain of dread. Cry, he thought. Fall apart. Call my mother. Call your mother. Do something human. Instead, she stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water. Her hand was perfectly steady. She took a slow, deliberate sip. Then she picked up her phone again. Ethan's stomach clenched. He knew that number. It was not his mother's. It was not her parents'. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering for a moment before pressing down. The call connected. Julian? She said. Her voice was different now. It was low, urgent, conspiratorial. It's me. It happened. A pause. Ethan could imagine Julian on the other end, the lazy confidence in his voice. Sooner than we thought, Clara continued, pacing the length of the living room rug. They just called. A heart attack. He's in the ICU at St. James. Her voice held no trace of grief. It held an electric current of excitement. No, I don't know how bad it is. They said critical. Listen, can you come over? Now? Before I have to go to the hospital and play the grieving wife. I need to see you. The words, play the grieving wife, landed like a physical blow. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't a test anymore. It was a verdict. And it was guilty. He watched, a spectator at his own funeral, as she moved through the house. She went into their bedroom, to his closet. She ran her hands over his suits, not with affection, but with a chilling, appraising touch, as if taking inventory. She opened his top dresser drawer, rummaging through his watches and cufflinks. He could almost hear her mind working, calculating, assessing value. Less than 20 minutes later, the doorbell didn't ring. The front door simply opened, and Julian walked in. He was exactly as Ethan remembered from the few times they'd crossed paths at social events. Tall, handsome in a blandly perfect way, wearing an expensive polo shirt and an air of effortless entitlement. He held up a key, dangling it from his finger with a smirk. Still works. Clara didn't answer. She flew into his arms and he kissed her, a deep, hungry kiss that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with conquest. It was a celebration. I can't believe it, Julian said, pulling back, his hands still on her waist. He was beaming. Our plan just got fast-tracked. Is he, you know? They said critical, Clara repeated. a strange, feverish smile on her face. "Julian, what if this is it? What if he doesn't make it?" "Then we have to move fast," Julian said, his eyes scanning the room, the same appraising look she'd had in the closet. "His assets. We need to get control before his family can get involved. You're his wife. You're the next of kin. His lawyer will have to talk to you." "I don't even know who his lawyer is," Clara said, a note of frustration in her voice. "He's so secretive about his work. This consulting nonsense. It's probably all just some piddling little retirement fund and the deed to this house." Julian laughed, a rich, arrogant sound that filled the room. "Don't worry, even a piddling fund is better than nothing. We'll drain it. We'll sell the house. We can use it as a down payment on a place in the hills, next to mine. We'll be free, Clara. No more pretending. No more living in this modest little box. No more putting up with Mr. Ambition Free." He pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair. "First things first," he murmured. "You have to go to the hospital. You have to look the part. Cry. Look pale. Be distraught. Can you do that?" "Of course," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I'm a good actress." Ethan sat back in his chair. The image on the screen was sharp and clear, the audio crystal. He felt strangely, terrifyingly calm. The pain was so immense it had become a kind of numbness, a white noise in his soul. He had wanted the truth. Now he had it. It was uglier, colder, and more complete than anything he had ever imagined. They weren't just having an affair. They were vultures, circling what they believed to be a dying animal, eager to pick the bones clean. He watched them for another 10 minutes. They discussed their future, their plans. They laughed about his taste in art, his choice of car, his quiet demeanor. They dissected him, belittled him, and erased him, all while standing in the house he had bought for them, for her. Finally, Clara pulled away. "I have to go. I should have been there by now. What do I do when I get there and they tell me he's—" "You break down," Julian instructed. "You become the tragic widow, and you get the name of his lawyer. That's the most important thing. Find out who holds the purse strings. Text me the second you know anything." She nodded, her face set with grim determination. She looked like a soldier being given her marching orders. She grabbed her purse and her car keys. At the door, she paused and looked back at Julian, who was now lounging on his sofa as if he'd owned it his entire life. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," he replied with a lazy smile. "Now go give my regards to your husband." The door closed. Julian remained on the sofa, pulling out his phone. Ethan watched for another minute, then reached for his own laptop and calmly, deliberately, disconnected the feed. The screen went black. The room was silent again. He sat alone in the dark, the echoes of their voices ringing in the emptiness. There was no more sadness. There was no more pain. There was only a cold, clear, and absolute purpose. The diagnosis was complete. It was time to begin the surgery. For a long time, Ethan didn't move. The black screen of the monitor reflected his own face, a pale, emotionless mask. The numbness that had enveloped him was beginning to recede, replaced by something else. It was not the hot, blinding rage he might have expected. It was a cold, quiet fury, as pure and as sharp as a diamond. It was the fury of a patient man whose patience had finally been exhausted. It was the fury of a builder who sees his creation willfully defiled and knows he must tear it down to the foundations. He stood up and walked to the small window of the office, looking down at the anonymous city street below. People hurried along the sidewalk, living their own dramas, oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred in his. He thought of Clara, at this very moment, driving to St. James Hospital. He pictured her striding through the automatic doors, her face artfully arranged into a mask of anguish. He saw her approaching the front desk, asking for him, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. The staff would have no record of him, of course. There would be confusion, then apologies. A mistake must have been made. She would call the doctor, David's burner phone, and it would go straight to a dead-end voicemail. Panic would set in then, but it would be the panic of a conspirator whose plan has gone awry, not the panic of a loving wife. The frustration, the anger, it would all be for herself. Ethan turned from the window. He was done imagining. It was time for action. He opened his briefcase and took out the worn, unassuming leather folder. He placed it on the small desk and opened it. For the past year, it had been his silent companion, his secret shield. Now, it was his arsenal. He didn't need to review the contents. He knew them by heart. But he did it anyway. A ritual of preparation, a final confirmation before battle. The first document was the prenuptial agreement. Clara and her parents had insisted on it, a move they thought was a clever way to protect her from his potential failures. They had no idea it was the very document that would protect him from her greed. It was ironclad, drafted by Evelyn Reed herself, clearly delineating his premarital assets, which, unknown to them, constituted 99% of his actual wealth, as his sole and separate property. Clara had signed it with a condescending little smile, as if it were a formality to protect her own, more promising future. Next were the summary sheets for the Phoenix Trust. He ran his finger down the columns of numbers, the lists of holdings, blue-chip stocks, commercial real estate in 3 major cities, a portfolio of tech startups. The total value was staggering, a number that the Vances, in their wildest dreams of status, could not comprehend. He had built this empire quietly, strategically, from a small inheritance he had leveraged with near preternatural skill. He hadn't hidden it out of shame. He had shielded it out of a desire for a genuine life, a life that had turned out to be a fiction. He paused on the third document. It was a single sheet of paper, a summary of the acquisition of Northgate Industries by his private equity firm, Talon Capital. He traced the lines of the organizational chart, a spider web of shell corporations and holding companies that all led back to the Phoenix Trust, which in turn led back to him. At the very bottom of the chart, in a small box, was Richard Vance, Senior Vice President. Richard went to work every day in a building owned by the man he openly disdained. He collected a salary paid by the man he considered a failure. The dramatic irony was so thick, so complete, it was almost poetic. Finally, he picked up a small, sealed envelope. This was his own edition, something Evelyn didn't even know about. It contained a single USB drive. On it were the audio and video files from the hidden cameras, time-stamped and logged. The conversation from this morning was the centerpiece, but there were others. Snippets of phone calls Clara had made to Julian over the past few months, thinking she was alone. Moments of her complaining to her mother about Ethan's lack of spark. It was a complete and damning mosaic of her betrayal. He closed the folder. The cold fury had now settled into something even more powerful, a profound and absolute clarity. He knew exactly what he had to do. His internal conflict, the balancing act between justice and his own integrity, was over. Justice was no longer about punishment. It was about truth. He would not be cruel. He would not be vindictive. He would simply hold up a mirror and force them to look at their own reflections. He would withdraw his presence, his protection, his silent support from their lives, and let them fall under the weight of their own arrogance. The consequences would not be his creation, but the natural and inevitable result of their own choices. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Evelyn Reed. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm and clear, "it's time. Execute the plan. Freeze the joint accounts. File the papers. I want you to be at my house tomorrow at 3 p.m. sharp. Bring the portfolio. Bring the Northgate file. Bring everything." "Consider it done," she replied, her voice all business. "The proof?" "I have it," Ethan said. "It's definitive." The second call was to Clara. He let it ring 5 times before he answered, letting her panic build. "Ethan? Oh my God, Ethan, is that you?" Her voice was a jumble of relief and frantic confusion. "Where are you? I went to the hospital. They said you weren't there. The doctor's phone isn't working. I've been going out of my mind." The performance was impressive. A lesser man might have been fooled, but Ethan had seen behind the curtain. He heard not love, but the thwarted frustration of a failed plotter. "There was a mistake, Clara," he said, his voice deliberately weak, weary. "A mix-up. It was another Ethan Miller. I'm fine. Just exhausted. My phone died. I'm sorry I worried you." "A mistake?" she screeched, the relief in her voice quickly being overtaken by shrill anger. "A mistake? I thought you were dying. I rushed out of the house. I broke every speed limit. I was a wreck." "I'm sorry," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "I'm on my way home now. But Clara, we need to talk. All of us." "What do you mean, all of us?" "You, me, your parents," Ethan said, his voice gaining a slight edge of steel. "There are things we need to discuss. About our future. I want them at the house tomorrow, 3 o'clock. There was a pause. He could hear her mind racing, recalibrating. The dying husband was suddenly alive. The simple asset grab was now a complicated confrontation. "Of course, darling," she said, her voice shifting back to one of sweet concern, the anger vanishing as if it had never been. "Whatever you want. I'm just so relieved you're okay. We were all so worried." "We." The word was a lie, but a useful one. "Good," Ethan said. "Then I'll see you at home, and I'll see them tomorrow." He hung up the phone. He packed the leather folder back into his briefcase, snapped it shut, and walked out of the sterile little room, leaving the darkness behind. The quiet before the storm was over. The wind was beginning to rise. The drive home was the longest of Ethan's life. The familiar streets of his neighborhood seemed alien, like a movie set for a film he was no longer a part of. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw Clara's car already there. He sat for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, gathering himself. He was no longer just Ethan Miller, husband. He was an actor about to step onto a stage for the most important performance of his life. He walked through the front door. Clara rushed to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "Oh, Ethan, I was so terrified." Her embrace was weightless, her body tense. Her perfume, the same expensive scent she always wore, seemed cloying and false. He did not embrace her back. He stood rigid, letting her cling to him. "I'm glad you're all right," he said, his voice flat. He gently disengaged himself from her arms. She pulled back, her face a carefully painted picture of concern, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. They were searching his face for clues, for weakness, for leverage. "You look pale. You should be resting. What was this about a mistake? It's unforgivable, whoever that doctor was, putting us through that." "It's over now," Ethan said, walking past her into the living room. The room looked different, violated. He could see Julian lounging on the sofa, smirking. He could hear their laughter, their callous plotting. The memory was burned into the very air. "Why did you ask my parents to come tomorrow?" she asked, following him. "If you're not feeling well, we should just be quiet. We can see them next week." She was trying to regain control, to delay, to manage the situation. "I'm feeling well enough," Ethan said, turning to face her. "And it can't wait. We have important things to finalize." The word finalize hung in the air between them. It was a word of endings. Her composure flickered, a flash of fear in her eyes before it was masked again by concern. "Finalize? What do you mean?" "Ethan, you're scaring me. You've had a shock. You're not thinking clearly." "On the contrary, Clara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "For the first time in a very long time, I am thinking with perfect clarity." He left her standing in the living room and went to his study, closing the door behind him. He needed to be alone, to preserve the cold, hard edge of his resolve. He knew the night ahead would be a long one, a pantomime of a marriage. He would have to endure her fake solicitude, her probing questions, her presence in their bed. It would be the final test of his endurance. The next day arrived, gray and overcast, the sky a mirror of Ethan's mood. He moved through the morning mechanically, speaking only when necessary. Clara fluttered around him, a parody of a concerned wife, offering him tea, suggesting he lie down, her every action a lie. He saw the surreptitious glances at her phone and knew she was coordinating with Julian, with her parents, preparing their strategy. They would arrive as a united front, ready to manage the emotional and unstable husband who had just had a health scare. At 2:45 p.m., a sleek black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Richard and Eleanor Vance emerged, their expressions a blend of solemnity and impatience. They were dressed for a funeral, or perhaps a corporate negotiation. Clara met them at the door, and there was a brief, whispered conference in the entryway. Ethan watched from the living room, unmoved. They were planning their angles, aligning their stories. He let them. The more confident they were, the harder they would fall. They entered the living room as a trio, a phalanx of arrogance. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice booming with false heartiness. "My boy, what a scare you gave us. We came as soon as we heard. You look a bit shaken. You should be in bed." "I'm fine, Richard," Ethan said, remaining seated in his armchair. He gestured to the sofa opposite him. "Please, sit down." They arranged themselves on the sofa, a tribunal ready to pass judgment. Clara sat slightly forward, poised to intervene. Eleanor appraised the room, her nose wrinkled in faint disapproval, as if noticing the dust for the first time. "Well," Eleanor said, breaking the silence, "Clara told us about the mix-up, a dreadful, dreadful thing. But all's well that ends well. The important thing is that you're safe." "Is it?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. The question caught them off guard. "Well, of course," Richard blustered. "What else matters?" "Truth matters, Richard," Ethan said. "Integrity matters." He let the words settle in the quiet room. He looked at each of them in turn. Richard, puffed up and self-important. Eleanor, brittle and condescending. And Clara, his wife, her beautiful face a mask, her eyes darting between him and her parents. "I asked you here," Ethan began, his voice calm and measured, "because I've done a great deal of thinking in the last 24 hours. About my life, about our marriage, about what matters." "Ethan, darling," Clara cut in, her voice dripping with saccharine concern. "Perhaps this isn't the time. You're stressed. We can talk about this later." "We'll talk about it now," Ethan said, his voice hardening just enough to silence her. He looked directly at Richard and Eleanor. "For 5 years you have made your disappointment in me abundantly clear. You find my career unimpressive, my home inadequate, my ambition lacking. You have compared me unfavorably and consistently to another man in my own home. You have treated me not as a son-in-law, but as a temporary inconvenience your daughter settled for." Richard scoffed, a deep, rumbling sound of indignation. "Now see here, we have always treated you with respect. Perhaps you're being a little oversensitive after your ordeal." "Am I?" Ethan's voice was like ice. "Do you remember Eleanor telling me my career was as charming as a woman's artisanal jam business? Do you remember suggesting I must feel intimidated driving my modest car? Do you remember, Richard, lauding Julian's promotion to junior partner at our first dinner together while questioning if I had a future?" He recited the insults without emotion, like a coroner listing causes of death. Each one was a small, sharp jab, puncturing their self-important balloon. They stared at him, momentarily speechless. They remembered. Of course they remembered. They just never expected to be called on it. "And you, Clara," he said, his gaze finally settling on his wife. "Through every insult, every slight, every moment of condescension, you were silent. Your silence was your vote. You were embarrassed by me. You felt I was holding you back from the life you believed you deserved, a life of Riva boats in Lake Como and being seen in St. Bart's. "This is ridiculous," Clara said, her voice rising. "You're twisting things. I love you." "Do you?" Ethan asked. The question was soft, but it carried the weight of a guillotine. "Is that why, when you thought I was dying in a hospital bed yesterday morning, the very first person you called was Julian?" The room went absolutely still. The air crackled. Clara's face went white, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. Richard and Eleanor stared, their mouths slightly agape. I don't know what you're talking about," Clara stammered, her eyes wide with genuine panic now. The mask was gone. This was real. "Don't you?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "You called him. You said, 'It happened.' You told him to come over before you had to go and play the grieving wife. Your words, Clara, not mine." He saw the truth dawn on her face, the horrifying realization that her secrets were not secret at all. She looked around the room wildly, as if searching for the source of the leak, for the hidden microphone, the betraying eye. "And he did come over, didn't he?" Ethan continued, his voice relentless. "With his own key. You kissed him. You celebrated. You planned to drain my piddling little retirement fund and sell my modest little box of a house so you could move to the hills. You stood here, in this room, and plotted how to pick my bones clean before my body was even cold." "No," she whispered, the word a faint, desperate breath. "No." Richard stood up, his face purple with rage. "How dare you? How dare you speak to my daughter that way? You're delirious. You're making up these vile, disgusting lies." "Am I?" Ethan said calmly. Just then the doorbell rang, a clear, sharp chime that cut through the tension. "That would be my lawyer. I believe she has some documents that will help clarify things." Ethan stood and walked to the door, leaving them frozen in a tableau of horror and disbelief. He opened it to find Evelyn Reed standing on the porch, a sleek leather briefcase in her hand. She was the embodiment of calm, corporate power. "Evelyn," Ethan said, "thank you for coming. You're right on time." He led her into the living room, into the heart of the wreckage. The Vances and Clara stared at this new player, a woman who radiated an authority they instinctively recognized and feared. "Richard, Eleanor, Clara," Ethan said, his voice now infused with the calm authority of a CEO addressing a hostile board. "This is Evelyn Reed. She is my lead counsel." Evelyn didn't smile. She opened her briefcase on the coffee table and took out a thick, bound document. She placed it on the table with a soft, definitive thud. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice blustering but laced with a new thread of anxiety. "That," Ethan said, "is a simplified summary of my personal net worth. I had it prepared because I knew the full version would be difficult for you to comprehend." He let them stare at the cover page, which simply read, "Phoenix Trust, Asset Portfolio Summary." "You see," Ethan continued, walking slowly around the room, a predator circling its cornered prey, "you've all been operating under a series of misconceptions. You believe I am a man of modest means. You believe my work is insignificant. You believe my ambition is non-existent. You are wrong, on all counts." He gestured to the document. "I am not a small, independent operator, Richard. I am the sole beneficiary of the Phoenix Trust, a private family trust established 3 generations ago. What you see as my consulting business is, in fact, me actively managing a portfolio of assets that your entire country club combined couldn't begin to approach. The rustic vacation villa in Asia, I own it, along with the 4 surrounding properties. The modest house we live in, I bought it with cash as a temporary residence while the plans for our real home were being drawn up. A 15,000 square foot property in the same hills you admire so much." Clara was staring at him, her face a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. Eleanor's hand was at her throat, her pearls suddenly feeling cheap and tight. Richard looked from Ethan to the document on the table, a vein throbbing in his temple. That's not possible, Richard stammered. You're lying. Am I? Ethan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn, perhaps you could provide Mr. Vance with the Northgate file. Evelyn produced a second, thinner folder. She opened it and slid a single piece of paper across the table toward Richard. It was the organizational chart, the one Ethan had studied in his lonely office. Richard picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. He stared at it. His eyes traced the lines, the boxes, the names of the parent companies. He followed the chain of command upwards, through Talon Capital, through a series of other entities, all the way to the top, to the Phoenix Trust, to Ethan Miller. The color drained from Richard's face. He understood. He understood that the man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed as a failure, was the ultimate owner of the company that paid his salary, his bonuses, his entire comfortable existence. He was an ant who had been insulting the boot that hovered over him. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, sinking back onto the sofa as if his legs could no longer support him. "And Julian," Ethan said, the name dropping into the silent room like a stone into a deep well. "The Rocket, the junior partner. His firm has been trying to secure my business for 3 years. I have turned them down 5 times. Julian is not my peer, Clara. He is a supplicant. A very, very minor one." He finally turned his full attention back to his wife. She was weeping now, silent tears tracking through her makeup. They were not tears of remorse. They were tears of loss. She was mourning the life she had just discovered she could have had, the life she had just spectacularly thrown away. "So you see," Ethan said, his voice softening, not with pity, but with the quiet finality of an ending. "This was never about money. I never wanted it to be. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for what I owned. I wanted a partner who would stand with me, not one who would weigh me and measure me and find me wanting. I failed to get that. And you failed every test, every single one." Evelyn slid a third document across the table. It was a single envelope addressed to Clara. "Those are divorce papers," Ethan said simply. "I have signed them. The prenuptial agreement you were so keen on is in full effect. All of my assets are protected. The joint accounts have been frozen as of 1 hour ago. This house will be sold. You will receive your share of the proceeds from its sale, and that is all. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." He paused, then added the final, devastating piece. "Evelyn also has a copy of a video file, a recording from this very room yesterday morning. It features you and Julian. I believe the term my lawyer used was irrefutable proof of infidelity. We will not need to use it, however, if you sign the papers without contest." The room was silent save for Clara's ragged, choked sobs. It was the sound of a world ending, the sound of arrogance turning to ash. Ethan felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, just a vast, hollow emptiness. He had his truth, and the truth had set him free. The immediate aftermath was a symphony of chaos conducted by Ethan's quiet, unyielding calm. Clara's sobs devolved into hysterical pleading. "No, Ethan, no. I love you. I made a mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake. Please, don't do this." Her words were meaningless noise. He had heard the words, "I love you," from her just the day before, directed at another man while they plotted his financial ruin. The currency of her affection was utterly devalued. "It's too late, Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He wasn't speaking to his wife anymore. He was speaking to a stranger he had once known. Love doesn't celebrate a supposed tragedy. It doesn't plot and conspire. What you feel now isn't love. It's regret for a prize you didn't realize you held until you'd already thrown it away. Eleanor, recovering from her initial shock, found her voice, a shrill, sharp weapon she had honed over decades. "You can't do this. This is cruel. She's your wife. You're destroying her. After all we've done for you, welcoming you into our family." Ethan turned his gaze on her, and his quiet intensity silenced her mid-sentence. "Welcomed me? You tolerated me. You belittled me. You actively encouraged your daughter to see me as less than she deserved. You built the foundation for this failure, Eleanor. You and Richard. You taught her that a man's worth is measured by his brand, not his character. Well, you have all seen the brand now. I hope you're satisfied." Richard, however, was a different case. The fight had gone out of him completely. The purple rage was replaced by a pasty, sickly gray. He was a man staring into an abyss, and the abyss was his own making. He wasn't thinking about his daughter's marriage. He was thinking about his mortgage, his country club membership, his career. "Ethan," he began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. He tried to stand, to approach Ethan as an equal, but his body seemed to betray him, and he remained hunched on the sofa. "Son, I misjudged you. I see that now. I was wrong. A foolish old man set in my ways." It was a pathetic, desperate appeal. Not an apology, but a bid for survival. Ethan looked at him, not with contempt, but with a kind of clinical pity. "You weren't just wrong, Richard. You were arrogant, and you were unkind. As for your job at Northgate, I won't have you fired." A flicker of hope ignited in Richard's eyes. "I won't have to," Ethan continued, his voice as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Your position as senior vice president is contingent on performance and the confidence of the board. Evelyn, would you say that news of Mr. Vance's son-in-law filing for divorce due to an affair, while also happening to be the ultimate owner of the company, might affect board confidence?" Evelyn, who had been observing the proceedings with the detached interest of a biologist watching microbes under a microscope, replied without missing a beat. "It would create a perception of profoundly poor judgment and a potential conflict of interest. It would make his position untenable. He would be invited to tender his resignation immediately to avoid a termination for cause." The last flicker of hope in Richard's eyes died. He slumped back, looking 20 years older than he had an hour ago. He had not been fired. He had been rendered obsolete. The system he worshipped, the cold, corporate logic of power and perception, was the very thing that would consume him. It was a poetic justice so complete it was almost beautiful. "Please leave," Ethan said, his voice resonating with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Evelyn will show you out. She will be in touch with your lawyer, Clara." Clara made one last, desperate lunge for him, grabbing his arm. "Ethan, please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. I'll do anything." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her tear-streaked face. "Can you go back in time, Clara? Can you unsay the things you said? Can you unfeel the joy you felt when you thought I was dying? Can you undo the kiss you shared with him in this room? Some things can't be fixed. They can only be ended." He gently removed her hand from his arm. The rejection was absolute. Defeated, she allowed her mother to pull her up from the floor. Eleanor guided her out, shooting Ethan a look of pure, undiluted hatred. Richard shuffled behind them, a broken man, not even bothering to look back. Evelyn closed the door behind them, the soft click sealing the end of an era. She turned back to Ethan, her expression softening for the first time. "Are you all right?" she asked. Ethan walked to the large window and looked out at the Mercedes pulling away, a hearse carrying the ghosts of his married life. The rain had begun to fall, washing the gray street clean. "I will be," he said, more to himself than to her. "Thank you, Evelyn, for everything." "It's my job," she said, "and if I may say so, it was a profound pleasure to deliver that particular set of documents." She gathered her things, her professionalism restored. "My office will handle everything from here. You won't have to speak to them again." "Good," he said. When she was gone, Ethan stood alone in the cavernous silence of the house. It was no longer a home. It was a property, an asset to be liquidated. He looked around at the art he had chosen, the furniture he had bought, the space he had tried to fill with love and hope. It was all tainted now, a museum of a colossal failure. He walked into his study and retrieved the small USB drive from its envelope. He walked back to the living room and looked at the spot on the shelf where the book had sat, its tiny lens recording the death of his marriage. Then he walked to the fireplace, switched on the gas, and tossed the drive into the flames. He watched until the plastic casing melted and warped, the secrets within consumed by the fire. He didn't need the evidence anymore. The truth had served its purpose. It was not a weapon for a protracted, ugly war. It was a key, and it had unlocked his cage. The weeks that followed were a blur of antiseptic legal correspondence and methodical dismantling. Ethan moved out of the house the very next day, taking only his personal effects and the worn leather folder. He left the furniture, the art, the kitchenware, the entire stage set of his former life. He moved into a sleek, minimalist penthouse apartment in the skyscraper his company owned, the one where Evelyn had her office. From his new windows, he could see the entire city spread out below him, a kingdom he had never bothered to claim. Clara, through her lawyer, made a few desperate attempts to contest the prenup, but the irrefutable evidence Evelyn held in reserve made it a fool's errand. The threat of the video's release was enough to ensure her immediate and total compliance. She signed the papers. The house was put on the market and sold within a month. As stipulated, the proceeds were split. Her share was a respectable sum, enough to live on for a few years if she were careful. But it was a pittance compared to the life she had thrown away. It was the price of her betrayal. News of Julian traveled back to him through the small, gossipy world of high finance. When the story of the divorce, framed discreetly as a simple case of infidelity, became known, and when Ethan's true financial stature became the subject of hushed rumors, Julian's firm was deeply embarrassed. They had been courting a titan without even knowing it, and their junior partner had been sleeping with his wife. Julian wasn't fired. He was simply sidelined. His rocket trajectory fizzled out. He was given a dead-end portfolio to manage and passed over for promotions. His ambition, the quality the Vances had so admired, had led him to fly too close to a sun he hadn't seen, and his wings had melted. The fate of the Vances was perhaps the most classically tragic. Richard was, as Evelyn had predicted, forced into an early retirement from Northgate. The severance package was standard, not punitive, but it was the end of his career and his identity. The loss of his salary, combined with his extravagant lifestyle, meant they had to sell their imposing colonial home. They downsized to a respectable, but far less grand, townhouse in a suburb. For Eleanor, the social fall was even more devastating than the financial one. Her friends, the ones she had gossiped with about Ethan's lack of status, now knew the truth. She was no longer the mother of the girl who married the brilliant Julian's successor. She was the mother of the girl who had fumbled an unimaginable fortune. The pity in their eyes was far worse than any animosity. She became a social pariah in the world she had worshipped, a living, cautionary tale about arrogance. One evening, about 6 months after the confrontation, Ethan received a letter. It was from Clara. Her handwriting was shaky, uncertain. He read it standing by the vast window of his apartment, the city lights a glittering carpet at his feet. It was a long, rambling letter, filled with apologies and self-recrimination. She wrote that she finally understood her mistakes, that she had been poisoned by her parents' values, that she had been blind and foolish. She wrote that she had ended things with Julian the day after the confrontation, that he had shown his true colors, anger and resentment at the loss of a potential payday, and she had seen him for the parasite he was. She wrote that she was in therapy. She wrote that she still loved him. And at the end, she asked if he could ever find it in his heart to forgive her, and if they could meet for coffee, just to talk. Ethan read the letter twice. He saw the pain in it, and for the first time he believed it was genuine. She was beginning to understand. But understanding was not absolution. He thought about her request. He could meet her. He could offer her a kind of peace, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it would be a mistake. Forgiveness was one thing. He could forgive her, in time, for his own peace of mind. But reconciliation was another. The trust between them hadn't just been broken, it had been pulverized. It was an antique vase shattered into 1,000 pieces, and no amount of glue could ever make it hold water again. To try would be to disrespect the profound lesson he had learned. He didn't write back. He didn't call. He simply let the silence be his answer. Her journey was her own now. He had to continue on his. He had learned the hardest lesson of his life, that you cannot make someone love you for the right reasons. You cannot hide your light under a bushel and expect them to see your soul. True worth is not something to be hidden or displayed. It is something to be lived. And true partnership is not about finding someone who is impressed by your strength, but someone who will defend you in your perceived weakness. Ethan had sought justice, and he had found it, not in the ruin of others, but in his own liberation. He was free. He was no longer the underestimated hero of someone else's story. He was simply the protagonist of his own, and the next chapter was waiting to be written. And so we come to the end of Ethan's story, but the beginning of his new life. He learned that the ultimate victory isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your own peace and integrity. The most powerful statement you can make is to live your truth, quietly and confidently, and to walk away from anyone who refuses to see it. What do you think? Was Ethan right not to respond to Clara's letter? Could there have been a path to forgiveness, or was the betrayal too absolute? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story of vindication and self-respect satisfying, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of human relationships. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, remember to value your own worth, even when others don't.